Today, Shabbat Shalom. And Shabbat Shalom to those of you on Zoom and YouTube. If it's a little cold in here today, it's because of all the ventilation that we have running through the sanctuary, and we're still getting to figure out what temperature we actually need to keep the thermostat. So I just made it warmer in here. So it should get a few degrees warmer over the next few minutes. But we've got a window and a fan, and we've got the HVAC system blowing, and we've got a significant amount of outdoor air getting pumped in here too. And so that's why that is a little bit chilly. You can feel the breeze if you're still, but we can always turn the heat up more and compensate. So we're working that out. So let us know if you're cold, and we'll figure out what that looks like, okay? And yeah, awesome. Well, let's jump in today. I'm going to keep going in our study on the book of Ephesians. This is our seventh message that we've been doing in the series. I think I started out saying we were going to do 2 messages, and I just couldn't just do little bits of it because it's so great. The book is just so terrific. So anyway, we're zeroing in on this book right now because our emphasis is on strengthening our community this year. And in Ephesians, Rav Shaul, or the Apostle Paul, shares with us the nuts and bolts of what makes a strong community in Messiah. So let me take just a minute to review where we've been, because the last few messages were a little bit focusing in on a few specific verses. In the first half of the book, Paul paints a larger theological reality that Israel is called forever. God has enlarged Israel's election then to include the Gentiles who would trust in Israel's Messiah, and these Gentiles now share in the promise given to Israel. Big picture, Paul unpacks God's great plan of reconciliation for all humanity under Yeshua's shared love. Paul loves to move from the grandiose to the on-the-ground reality. So in verse 4:4, Paul writes, "Therefore I, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you were called, with complete humility and gentleness, with patience, putting up with one another in love, making every effort to keep the unity of the Ruach and the bond of Shalom." I love that verse, so I just read it as a way to review. That's what this whole book is about. This is a message for Ruach Israel this year. After we talked about using our gifts to build one another up, we've emphasized the gift of hospitality and Shabbat dinners. And the last 2 messages we discussed in some depth how to deal with anger in our hearts and families and community. Get rid of all bitterness, Paul says, rage and anger and quarreling, along with malice. And instead be kind to one another, compassionate, forgiving each other just as God and Messiah also forgave you. So now let's jump into chapter 5. And chapter 5 is a beautiful chapter. We're gonna walk through verses 1 through 20, and I have them up on the slide. So if you have your Bibles, you can do that. I'll be picking a few verses out, so if you have your Bibles, you'll be able to see everything. And so we are at chapter 5, verse 1 on the next slide. And what I want to do is treat this this time more like a Bible study, reflect on the verse, and then tie it together with Paul's big message for our community as we come to the end. And you'll see some really neat things that connect together. So, chapter 5, verse 1. "Therefore, be imitators of God as dearly loved children, and walk in love just as Messiah also loved us and gave himself up for us as an offering and a sacrifice to God for a fragrant aroma." And consider how a child responds to a father when he feels deeply loved versus a child who does not feel deeply loved. Most young children, when they're small, they look up to their dads as the great hero of their lives. A young son wants to be just like dad in every way. And it can be ennobling for a father. Some of you have experienced that. It could also feel like a great weight on a dad when he realizes that, he can't live up to the reflection of himself that he sees in his son's eyes. And sometimes the fear of failure is enough to derail some dads, and they check out. So dads, don't do that. Little side note, don't do that. It's not good. Kids don't need a perfect dad. They don't need an idealized dad. They just need a dad who will show up, who loves them. Because no matter how heroic the father, one day all children will realize that there are flaws in dad. And here comes the great test of how well a father has loved. Kids who feel deeply loved by their dads, they still admire their dads, even in their faults. Kids who don't feel deeply loved experience a wound inside, and counselors call it the father wound. Paul uses this strong analogy, I'm painting this picture, to show that when he says, be imitators of God as dearly loved children, we need to follow God's ways in the same way a child wants to follow his dad when he is deeply loved. And I actually think that our primary role as parents isn't to be idolized, but instead to reflect enough of God's character and invest enough training and teaching and prayer that our kids would look past us and then look to God. How do we imitate God? Paul says to walk in the love of Messiah, to give of ourselves just as he gave himself up for us as an offering, as a fragrant aroma, a sacrifice. We're supposed to look to God so much in every area of our lives that we literally give ourselves up. A burnt offering includes every part. Think of what this means for Paul's communities. Everyone in the community giving of themselves as a whole self-offering. Life is not about your own needs as much as it is about the needs of others in your faith community. That's Paul's message. Paul is telling us to flee from self-centered living and to look outward towards others. Don't look inward, look outward. And this message sets the stage for the next verse, which are a bit more challenging. So let's move to verse 3. But sexual immorality and any impurity or greed, don't even let these be mentioned among you as is proper for the kedoshim, for the holy ones, for the believers. Obscene, coarse, and stupid talk are also out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. Know for certain that no immoral, indecent, or greedy person who is really an idol worshiper at heart has any inheritance in the kingdom of Messiah and of God. So, tough passage, isn't it? I mean, this is a tough one to talk about. We like to tackle tough passages here. And it's good if, I think it's good if that makes you sort of squirm a little bit because it's a hard passage. The last time my last Ephesians message, I said that Paul is a Musar master. Practicing godly character is one of Paul's favorite topics to write about. It's in every letter. He doesn't just tell us not to do something wrong. He always replaces it by instructing us to practice the opposite. Classic Musar practice. A godly quality that fills the gap where the old behavior once was. So it's not enough to simply stop the wrong behavior. It doesn't work. We also need to be active in practice and do the opposite. So here, what's the midah, or the quality that Paul brings out in place of these things? It's appropriate for the season. Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is both an emotion, we feel thankful, and then an action, we give thanks. These two things come together. Don't let yucky words come out of your mouth, but words that give thanks. Words that are filled with gratitude, we might say. Thankfulness is feeling grateful for God's work in our lives. That's a nice way to define thankfulness. Thankfulness is being filled with gratitude to God, feeling it, expressing it, thinking it. We must cultivate a thankful spirit and look to the work that God is doing amidst the struggles and the blessings. It's not just we thank Him for the blessings. It's we thank Him for the work that He's doing in the struggles alike. And remember, big picture, Paul is not saying that as individual people, we just need to be filled with thanksgiving, but that Ruach Israel must be a community filled with thanksgiving, a community filled with blessings and praises to the Lord. And Paul nailed it. What's so critical about thanksgiving is that it's a quality that requires us to look outward, outside of ourselves. True thanksgiving is not just a feeling that we cultivate inside about something we like. Think of this. True thanksgiving requires a giver outside of ourselves. It requires a relationship with people and God. Thanksgiving requires relationship. It generates all kinds of other heart qualities. It's like the source of generosity and service and sacrifice and kindness and love. So if you think about this, thanksgiving and selfishness in communities can't coexist. Thanksgiving gets rid of selfishness. Selfishness looks inward to protect oneself. Thanksgiving looks outward to bless others in generosity. And Thanksgiving is one of Paul's solutions to all of the selfish problems that we just read about. I find it really interesting that sexual immorality here is right next to greed in the same list. Often, communities tend to focus on one or the other. The stereotype is that the fundamentalist is concerned with sexual immorality, while the progressive is concerned with greed. But Paul makes no distinction. Greed and sexual immorality are of the same cloth. They have the same heart. Both are focused on things as a means to satisfy their own desires. Both treat people as things. People become a tool towards some other gain rather than the purpose themselves. The purpose themselves. So think of it like this. Creation, which is something that God called us to be stewards over, becomes something that's consumed and something that's thrown away. Whether that's by using a person for pleasure or consuming more and more of God's resources for our own prosperity. In progressive society today, what makes sexual acts and expression moral or immoral is consent. That's what it is. It's whether it's consented or not. But first of all, consent has less and less meaning in the context of social pressures and confusing messaging in the world. And more, consent is not the only way the Torah defines sexual expression. Consent is one important biblical principle in the Torah, but in the Torah there are acts that are forbidden regardless of mutual agreement or feelings or the passions of those involved. So biblically, when Paul says sexual immorality, he means any sexual act that's outside of what's permitted in the Torah. Why? Because the moment we step outside of God's plan for his creation, we begin using God's creation for our own personal purposes, rather than caring for it in the ways that God has permitted. And the same is true with wealth, and the same is true with power. The same is even true with food. Keeping kosher, think of this as a good example. It requires limits on something that we do every day. Keeping kosher requires us to be aware of God's purposes in creating the world around us at every meal. So we might like bacon, for example, but God says Jews shouldn't eat it. So we don't, because it puts God ahead of our own personal desires and our own personal passions. Greed is wanting more than what God has given you. Even deeper, greed does not value the things that God has given you or the parameters that God has given us to live within. That's greed. So greed looks to the world for fulfillment and happiness. Greed requires a person to take more, to care less. And so these verses give us pause when we think about our disposable society that we live in. Sex becomes a tool to sell products, which just feeds more greed. Use less. Be content with what we have. These are things that lead to generosity and care and self-control and godliness and healthy communities. I wonder if this is why Paul says obscene, coarse, and stupid talk are out of place. Because when we speak that way, it tears people down. They're mocking. It uses people. Either they're in the way and our words become a bulldozer to get by, or we feel the need to tear people down to build ourselves up. Or perhaps a person is just so filled with anger that the world seems sinister and gray around them, and they feel the need to curse God's creation using words without care or sensitivity to who would be around. That's why language is so important. Your language matters. So we need to be here a community where people are the end goal, not the means to get something else. God's world is supposed to reflect God's goodness. We are to honor it. We are to care for it as an act of creation. And anything else, for Paul, is idolatry. Creation worship rather than worshiping God through his wondrous creation. Paul's words are very strong. Know for certain that no immoral or indecent or greedy person They're really an idol worshiper at heart. They have no inheritance in the kingdom of Messiah of God. I mean, that's strong. No inheritance. How can this be? I wonder if we look back to Ephesians 2:10, where Paul says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Messiah Yeshua for good deeds, which God prepared before him so we might walk in them." You and I here, we're made for God's workmanship. We're made for the good deeds of creation that he has given for us. And so when we exalt ourselves in our desires and our passions and our pleasures and our wants above God or outside of God's parameters, we're going against our very nature. Perhaps we stop being who we were created to be, and then we just simply can't exist in the kingdom of God anymore. Our kids love a book series called The Knights of Eritrea. It's an allegory set in medieval times. Eritrea is a land like earth, and heaven is called the land across the sea, the great sea. And God is the king of that land, and he sends his son, who's a prince. It's a metaphor of the Gospels and the whole Bible, really. And at one point, the ships are setting sail, kind of like a Revelation scene, to ferry the followers of the king across the land of the sea. And one man is forced to stay back. And it says, "You made your home in Eritrea. Now you need to stay there. You can't go to the land of the sea. So don't make your home here on earth." Yeshua says, "Where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth or rust or destroy, and thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Matthew 6. The greed and the immorality and the idolatry that Paul describes here is heathenism. Paul realizes that communities shape our identity and communities shape our action. So it's bigger than just individual here, because if we go to the next slide, Paul continues in verse 7, "Therefore, do not be partners with them, for once you were darkness, but now in union with the Lord and light, walk as children of the light." And skipping to verse 10, trying to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. This is what it says: "Wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, the Messiah will shine on you." Wake up. Wake up is very strong language. He's using language drawing from Isaiah here. And when Israel is caught in the snares of idolatry before they're destroyed by the Babylonian exile, wake up, he says. Don't be partners with them. Them is the former pagan community that these new Ephesian believers were a part of. They had shared life with them, and now they're supposed to get rid of that and share life with Israel in Messiah. That's chapter 3. Paul urges this community to get rid of their old heathen community ties and lifestyle and put on Messiah's community identity. Don't be joined with them, but instead be joined together in God's community, joined with one another in sharing life together in Messiah. And then as a community, you will be light in a dark world. That's his message. This is a message for Ruach Israel this year. This is a message for our community. Walking with Messiah is not just about a bit of religion on the sidelines of a busy life. It is our life. Jewish life is covenant with God, and it's not meant to be lived alone. Life with Messiah, even more so, is our primary communal identity, our decisive community. And let me qualify, because we've all heard and experienced unhealthy communities. When we talk about focus on community life, unhealthy community, what makes an unhealthy community and abuses and all kinds of things that cause people to shy away from community life, it's not strong shared commitment to community life. Unhealthy community comes from a community that's hierarchical. Cults usually have one leader who requires submission, and the cult leader shapes people. And people are persuaded to, the phrase, drink the Kool-Aid and all things get weird, when this is the kind of communal dynamic that's happening. But that's not a healthy, godly community. Healthy faith community is a community where the members join themselves with each other. In Paul's language, we're members of one another. So Rabbi Rich and I, we we serve as leaders, but that's just because we're fellow members, also in covenant with God and with each other. So you're leaders too, and we all come along together to make a small part of God's larger community, joined together in the shared love and shared covenant with God in Yeshua. We can go to the next slide. As we close out this passage, Paul continues, so pay close attention to how you walk, not as unwise people, but as wise. Make the most of your time because the days are evil. For this reason, do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is, and do not get drunk on wine, for that is reckless. I wondered this week why don't get drunk on wine was listed here. It seems sort of like an afterthought. Remember that, don't do that. But as I reflected on it, I wonder if Paul was saying, do not allow yourselves to be blinded by the things of the world. Don't just check out and self-medicate. Instead, be wise. I don't think Paul, is saying that we need to be a community of individuals who read a lot of books. I mean, reading books is great, but I don't think that's what he's saying. He means that we should be a community of sages, a community who knows how to live in healthy relationships, a community of people who knows how to live life well. Wisdom. We've made the most of our time in our community because we've lived the span of life together with the Messiah, seeking the Lord's will day by day, prioritizing each other and prioritizing the things that are most important to God. That's Paul's message. We should not be self-centered, but be other-centered. We will go on to discuss how this plays out in marriage life and things like that. That's the next part of Ephesians for another message. But Paul closes this section with a message as if it was just for us today. Ralph, you go to the next slide. Last half of verse 18. Instead, be filled with the Ruach, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making music to your heart in the Lord, always giving thanks for everything to God the Father, in the name of the Lord Yeshua, the Messiah. These beautiful words, I don't think, are just a Pollyanna bliss that ignores life's many problems and whitewashes them away. This is a way of life that we need to cultivate within life's many problems. Paul wants Ruach Israel to be a Messianic Jewish community who comes together to be filled with the Ruach, to sing psalms and praise and to make music in our hearts to the Lord, always giving thanks for everything together to God the Father in the name of the Lord Yeshua, the Messiah. In Judaism, we build this into ritual life. We have a blessing for everything. Our service and liturgy is filled with learning and psalms and music and thanksgiving. We've been doing that all morning today. In Messiah, how much more so must our homes and our families and our community be filled with learning and music and joy and thanksgiving in relationship with one another. That's the kingdom of heaven here. That's how we bring the kingdom of heaven here. So Paul's big message for us in chapter 5 is that the message of the good news is not just a message of something that God did 2,000 years ago. It's a message that our Ruach Israel community must live together today. We must live differently. We must be people who are learning to live together in love, to make mistakes together, to forgive together, to correct each other together. A community of people who look away from themselves to give outward. We are to be a community where others are then brought into the life of God through our singing and our music making and our joy and our heart for the Lord. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. And we'll do just that with the Aleinu.